Hello, my name is Craig Fraker. I'm with the Goochland Powhatan Master Gardener Association, and I am for the soil because I like to play in the dirt.
And here we go with episode number 101 of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii. My co-host, Eric Benfelt, and Mary Sketch Bryant will be joining us in just a few moments, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of our listeners for your overwhelming responses, positive responses concerning the 100th episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. If you have not heard that episode, you can find it at the website forthesoil.org. And of course, that's the digit 4, thesoil.org. And it's also available on numerous podcast platforms. But thank you so much for your responses, the positive responses to that 100th episode. And here we go with episode 101. Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, with my co-host, Eric Benfelt, with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And by the way, if you haven't heard our 100th episode of the podcast, we recently recorded that, and it is available on all your standard podcast platforms, on Apple Podcast, on Spreaker, on YouTube, and of course at the website forthesoil.org. And I guess, guys, this makes this episode number 101. We're in our second century of episodes. Mary, if you would please introduce our special guest today.
Thanks, Jeff. Really excited to have Summer Thomas with us. We have doubled our Virginia Soil Health Coalition staff recently. Summer is the new education and outreach specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition through Virginia Tech, based in the Blacksburg area, and has a long history with agriculture, with soil health, and so just brings a wealth of knowledge to the work. Grew up on her family's dairy and grain farm in Delaware, and her passion for agriculture then expanded through college and in receiving her PhD at Virginia Tech. So go Hokies. So we're excited to talk to her today about all of her background from her youth up through now. So thanks for being with us, Summer. And to kick things off, would love to just, if you could go into a little how your background in agriculture sparked your interest in soil science.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I grew up, very involved in agriculture from the beginning. I used to get off the kindergarten school bus at my family's milking parlor, and I could expect maybe my mom, maybe my dad, or even the milkman sometimes to be waiting for me. And it was just so magical to see, my whole family working on the farm to put, food on our table, but also on, our growing population's table. So we were a dairy farm. The farm was established in 1938, Thomas Family Farms in Marydale, Delaware. And they milked cows up until 2005. We could house about, a little over 1,000 head. And we were milking, about 3 times a day. And then in 2005, we said goodbye to the milking herd. And I think it was very bittersweet for my dad. I remember him saying he was sad to see them go, but now a lot more, flexibility and free time as well. And then we continued our grain operation, so corn, soybeans, sorghum, wheat, barley, and then recently diversified into a little bit of lima beans and string beans. So from a very young age, I knew that I wanted to be involved in agriculture in some way, shape, or form.
And then, Summer, with that, you mentioned the dairy cows and the grain aspects. What in particular about soil science that really sparked your interest?
Absolutely. So I was fortunate, I'm third generation on both sides, and my great grandfather, he was, very pivotal in the state of Delaware and with conservation. So he always had a conservation mindset that he instilled in my grandfather, which then trickled down to my father. So, viewing these the dairy operation, and the grain operation, thinking about all aspects that go into that system. So, if we want to produce healthy animals or a healthy crop, we need to start from the bottom up and with the soil. So continuing with practices, with no-till and cover cropping, my family has always tried to have that conservation stewardship mindset, first when it comes to all of the agriculture practices on the farm. And that really I started to see that, and that's really what started me onto the path of soil science. Everything that's good comes from the ground, as I like to say. And that's what really, pushed me into continuing my education in agriculture, but specifically starting to look at soil science when I was at University of Delaware in my undergrad. And I did a minor in soil science and then continued into grad school with it, and couldn't be happier.
In Summer, if I'm remembering right, you have a minor in soil science and in agribusiness, and that's such a unique combination, because we know that agriculture it's a business at the end of the day, and we need to ensure that it's profitable, sustainable, resilient. Where do you see that intersection of those two pieces of your studies?
Yeah, so with my studies and then what my studies have allowed me to do, in this past year, which is work with producers, I feel like people, with going to these producers' farms, they understand that, to produce a good, viable product and, have a successful business, you need to start from the ground up. And things like, a healthy soil will allow you to create a resilient business. You're looking at the whole system. And a lot of farmers that I've been working with, they have understood that, principle of, we need to start with the soil. And what's been so great about, this past year working directly with producers is, even though they may have known that, some didn't know just how to get started. And that's where, the 4 principles came in, and just explaining by taking this one small step forward, you can start to create, a resilient farm business. And a lot of these producers, they want to work for themselves, but also to be able to have the farm there for future generations. So by creating that resilient system and, starting with soil health, and it can continue for future generations.
We're talking today with Dr. Summer Thomas. She is Education and Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And Summer, I'd like to ask you about your involvement with the 4-H program. I understand that you grew up in 4-H, and I guess it's really a two-part question. Number one, what did you learn in 4-H that prepared you for what you're doing today? And number two, do you recall any specific examples of how you got involved with soil health as a 4-H'er?
Absolutely. So when it comes to 4-H, I can remember when I was younger, my mom entered me into the public speaking contest for 4-H. And she said, you may dislike me now for doing this, but eventually you will, be pleased and, be happy that you, took the chance and started public speaking. And I am so grateful to her from the beginning with 4-H getting me involved in public speaking. 4-H and both FFA, they kind of allowed, they were the launch pads for me into education and outreach. They allowed me to take what I was passionate about and, apply it in different spaces and start to be an advocate. So public speaking was one. I did different, I was on the dairy judging team. I did different livestock projects. I showed at the fair, and started to, connect science and being on the farm with different real world examples and different problem solving issues. So those early experiences, really helped shape, what I wanted to do as I continued and be involved in education and outreach. And I think the biggest thing with 4-H and soil health is, being in 4-H and involved in all these different projects, understanding how to be, land stewards and thinking about all of these different projects, how agriculture affects everybody, and how we can also make agriculture fun for the next generation. And I'm an example of that. Without 4-H and FFA, I wouldn't have had those experiences that I did. And I think those are really what, pushed me into that outreach world.
And Summer, I think this question is, I know you've done research and also been promoting watermelons, and I think there's more
Really? We have a
interest in.
watermelon specialist and you didn't tell me?
A watermelon queen, to be exact.
Well, there's more interest in taste and flavor and the connections to soil, and I imagine in Delaware they grow some really good watermelons, and just your experience with promoting watermelons.
Sure. So back in college, I was always familiar with the Maryland and Delaware Watermelon Association, and they have what's called a Queen program. So many of the top producing watermelon states, they have promotional ambassadors. So they're queens. And really, as a watermelon queen, we got to use our crown as a megaphone to talk about, the importance of buying local, supporting your local farmers, and just agriculture in general, and talk to consumers and, kind of spread that information about what's going on, at the farms next door or down the road. So as the watermelon queen, I really got to travel across Maryland and Delaware, as well as states that imported Maryland and Delaware watermelon, to encourage people to buy local and, talk about, these wonderful products that these wonderful producers were making and distributing. So that was, I truly like to say, one of the best jobs in the world, and another thing that has pushed me to continue in the education and outreach world. I like to serve as almost a middleman, per se, between producer and consumer, and just be an agriculture advocate. And the Watermelon Association allowed me to do just that.
And Summer, a fun fact that we haven't brought up yet is you also teach some at the college level at Virginia Tech. And I just want to tell a little story before getting to the question. As we got to work together, one of your first weeks on youth conservation camp back in July, June, and which brought a bunch of high schoolers together to learn about different conservation topics. And you led a soil station with NRCS. And it just made me realize that you never know the impact that you are having on someone. As at the end of the day, when one of the students just walked by and said, "Oh, I never knew soils were so cool." And who knows, that person may go on to have a career in soil science, to do something. What do you think is the most important thing when you're educating youth, whether it's college age, high school, in just building that spark?
Absolutely. So teaching has been one of my favorite things that I've been able to do over the last year. So I taught a forage crop ecology class in the spring semester, and then I'm teaching agronomic crops coming up in the fall. And I think the biggest things is, what can make the biggest impact is giving students the opportunity to kind of be hands-on with different activities. So what I really like, and whenever I talk to different extension agents or trainers, our biggest thing I think we try to brainstorm is demonstrations that we can do and provide to students, because putting soil in the perspective of, just one example is we do a Cheerios demo, and with these Cheerios we pour them into a cup, use a little bit of milk, and to look at aggregate stability. And then the students actually get to, taste those Cheerios and think about how, by just changing structure of the Cheerios, we're changing its function, and it's the same with soil. And when students are able to do that, hands-on and look at it at a different perspective, that's when they start to get that light bulb of, oh, soil is pretty cool. So I think, hands-on and different demonstrations, and, explaining, especially in agriculture and soil, that it connects everything. Whatever their interest may be, there's a connection to soil.
We're talking today with Dr. Summer Thomas, Education and Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Just a couple of minutes remaining, Summer, and I wanted to ask you about some resources available to our listeners. Of course, number one, I'm going to recommend our website at forthesoil.org, and that is the digit 4, thesoil.org. But what other resources do people have available to learn, whether it's in their backyard vegetable garden on 1,300 acres of watermelons?
Yes. So the biggest thing I would say is reach out to your extension agent. So Virginia Cooperative Extension is there to, help and answer your questions and connect you with, different resources. If you have a great idea and potentially looking for funding, extension is one way that they can connect you, or just a simple question. Virginia Cooperative Extension is there to help. And they can connect you with a wide range of other resources across the state. And of course, Mary and I, and all of those across the state in the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, NRCS, your Soil and Water Conservation District, those are all resources that are willing to help.
Well, great. And thank you for everything that you do in regards to soil health and the education and outreach of the various programs. And it's been a real pleasure to have you on the program today.
It's been wonderful. Thank you guys so much.
Dr. Summer Thomas, Education and Outreach Specialist with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Eric and Mary, we'll catch y'all in the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Summer and Jeff.
Thank you all.
For the Soil, a Conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you should have a specific question about soil health, feel free to call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.